It was just another quiet night in the vastness of space. Captain Ethan Carter was aboard his small reconnaissance ship, cruising through the dark void. He was alone, drifting between planets on a routine mission. The stars sparkled like diamonds, and the silence of space was only broken by the hum of his ship's engines. Everything seemed calm, until the lights on his dashboard blinked wildly, and an alarm screamed to life, shattering the peace. A shadow passed over his ship. At first, it was nothing more than a fleeting dark shape, but then it became clear. Dozens of alien ships, their designs unfamiliar and menacing, surrounded him. Ethan's pulse quickened. He knew there was something wrong, something that had gone horribly awry. He scrambled to activate the ship's weapons, but before he could even react, the alien ships fired, disabling his engines and locking him in place. Panic surged through him, but his training took over. He reached for the communication system, hoping to contact Earth. But the screen only flashed static. He didn't have time to think. A loud thud echoed through the ship as it was pulled in by a powerful tractor beam. The force of it slammed him back into his seat, his body pressed against the restraints. He tried to fight against it, but it was no use. The ship was completely at the mercy of whatever alien force had taken control. Through the small viewport, he could see them. Large, menacing ships that seemed to block out the stars themselves. They moved with precision, as if this wasn't the first time they'd done this. Ethan's mind raced. Who were these aliens? What did they want with him? He had no answers, only an overwhelming sense of dread. The ship was dragged into one of their massive vessels. As the tractor beam released, the hold doors opened, revealing a cold, sterile hallway. The ship's interior was nothing like the human ships he had grown accustomed to. The walls were sleek and dark, and there was an oppressive silence in the air. His heart thudded in his chest as he unstrapped himself from the seat and stood up shakily. He had to get out. There had to be a way. Before he could even think of making a move, a door slid open, and strange, towering figures appeared. They were unlike anything he had ever seen. Tall, their skin shimmering with a silvery glow, their eyes glowed faintly as they stepped forward, and their voices were strange, alien in nature. One of them, seemingly the leader, spoke in a language he couldn't understand, but the tone was clear enough. Mocking. It was as if they had already won, as if they believed humanity was no longer a threat. Without a word, they moved forward, their long arms reaching for him. Ethan fought back instinctively, but his strength was no match for theirs. They seized him, and in seconds, he was dragged down the hallway and into a small, dimly lit cell. His heart pounded as they locked him inside, leaving him alone with nothing but his thoughts. In the silence that followed, he could only wonder what fate awaited him. The galaxy, once vast and filled with unexplored mystery, now seemed like a cold, dangerous place. But something inside Ethan told him that he wasn't going to be a helpless victim. He was a soldier. He had fought before, and he would fight again. His mind raced with ideas of how to escape, how to take down these invaders. His pride as a human wouldn't allow him to be a prisoner forever. As he sat in the darkness of the cell, one thought repeated over and over in his mind. They will pay for this. The fire of vengeance was igniting within him, and no matter what it took, no matter how impossible it seemed, he would make them regret ever crossing paths with a human. But for now, he had no choice but to wait, to bide his time. He had to be smart. Patience would be key. The aliens might have captured him, but they hadn't broken his spirit. And as the hours stretched into days, Ethan's resolve only grew stronger. His time would come, and when it did, the galaxy would tremble at the wrath of one human soldier. You said. The cell was cold, dark, and silent. Ethan's eyes had adjusted to the gloom, but it didn't make the space any less suffocating. He could feel the heavy weight of isolation pressing in on him. But his mind was sharp. His body ached from the rough treatment, but his thoughts were clearer than ever. He had been captured, yes, but he was far from defeated. He had fought in battles before, but this This felt different. He had no idea who these aliens were or why they had taken him. But one thing was certain. They had made a huge mistake. He wasn't some weakling. He was a soldier, and no matter how powerful these aliens seemed, he wasn't going down without a fight. Ethan got up from the cold floor and paced the small cell. There had to be a way out. He couldn't just wait for his captors to decide his fate. They'd underestimated him, and that was their first mistake. He'd watched their movements closely when they brought him in. They were confident, sure, but they were sloppy. He wasn't going to let that slip. The door to his cell was locked tight, but that was nothing he couldn't work around. Ethan had trained for this. Escape, stealth, and sabotage were all part of his military training. It was just a matter of finding the right moment to strike. He wasn't afraid, not yet. His hands were steady as he examined the walls. There were small vents, barely noticeable, high up near the ceiling. It was a long shot, but it might just be his way out. He spent hours silently working, analyzing every small detail of the cell. There were no windows, no way to see what was beyond the thick walls. He had no idea if anyone was guarding him or if the aliens even bothered to check on him regularly. The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. He had to focus on what he could control. The hunger and thirst were starting to set in, but Ethan barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, consumed with thoughts of escape. His hands had been searching for any kind of weakness in the walls or the door, and he found one. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A small seam where the metal of the door didn't quite line up. It wasn't much, but he knew exactly what to do with it. Every now and then, footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. Each time, his heart would race, and he'd freeze, straining to hear any sign of movement. If they came for him now, he'd have no chance to fight back. But so far, they hadn't come. He didn't know whether that was good or bad. Time seemed to stretch on forever in the silence of the cell. Ethan focused on his breathing, trying to stay calm. His muscles ached from the hours of inactivity, but he didn't let it break his concentration. The aliens had no idea who they were dealing with. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, there was a slight shift in the air. A faint buzzing sound. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His ears perked up, and he instinctively pressed himself to the floor. The sound grew louder, then faded, only to return again. It was coming closer. A guard. Ethan's eyes widened as he quickly slid into a shadowy corner, his body still and his breath shallow. The guard's footsteps were heavy, almost deliberate. They stopped just outside his cell. Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't make a sound. If he was lucky, the guard would leave him alone. If he wasn't, this would be his first real test. The door to his cell slid open, and a tall, shadowy figure entered. Its eyes glowed faintly, scanning the room. The guard's attention shifted around the cell, and for a moment, Ethan was certain he'd been spotted. But the alien didn't seem to notice him in the shadows. It continued its slow, deliberate pacing. Ethan held his breath. The alien moved closer to the far wall, his back turned. This was it, his chance. With a burst of adrenaline, Ethan sprinted toward the door, his movements swift and silent. He grabbed the small metal shard he had found earlier, using it as a tool to pry open the door's weak seam. With a little force, the door groaned and creaked, but it budged. Just enough. The guard didn't hear a thing. Ethan slipped through the door, staying low to the ground. His heart hammered in his chest, but his mind was clear. The corridor outside was dimly lit, and there were no immediate signs of other guards. This was his moment. He had to keep moving. As he crept down the hallway, every step felt like it could be his last. He didn't know how far he had to go, or where the exit was, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to die in a cell. Not today. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar. Ethan's pulse raced. He was close now. He just needed to get outside, and he would figure the rest out as he went. If he could reach the alien ship's control room, he could wreak havoc, maybe even take back some of the control. But first, he had to survive the journey through this dark maze. He couldn't stop now. Not when he was this close. Every instinct screamed at him to keep going. And if these aliens thought they had him, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The hallway stretched on endlessly, its metallic walls reflecting the dim, pulsating light that seemed to come from nowhere. Ethan's breath was shallow, his senses on high alert. The air was thick with the tension of his escape. Each step echoed faintly, but he moved with precision, his every instinct guiding him forward. There was no turning back now. The moment he stepped out of the cell, he had sealed his fate. Either he would make it out alive or perish trying. And Ethan Carter wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. He paused at a corner, peering around cautiously. The hallway ahead was clear, but that didn't mean it was safe. These aliens were methodical. They wouldn't leave their prisoners unguarded for long. The thought of being caught again made his blood boil, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now, not when freedom was within reach. Ethan's mind raced as he moved forward, his hands brushing against the smooth walls, searching for anything that could help him. There had to be a way to sabotage this ship, a way to send a message. The sooner he could cause chaos, the better. Maybe then, the galaxy would understand the true power of humanity. He passed a few doors, each one leading to unknown rooms. Some were locked, others were simply ajar. He didn't risk opening them. They could be filled with more aliens, and he wasn't prepared for a fight just yet. His goal was survival, not confrontation. Then he came to another door. It was bigger, reinforced with what looked like thick metal. His heart rate sped up, and his instincts screamed at him that this could be the key to everything. This had to be where the control room was, the heart of the ship where they made decisions, where they planned their movements. If he could get in there and disable their systems, it might be enough to cripple the ship and create the chaos he needed. He had to get in. There was no other choice. He reached for the door handle, but before he could touch it, the sound of footsteps reached his ears. Loud, deliberate. Someone was coming. Panic surged within him. There was nowhere to hide. There were only seconds to act. In a desperate move, Ethan pushed himself against the wall, holding his breath. His body tensed, and every muscle screamed to move, but he stayed perfectly still, his eyes locked on the door. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The door creaked open, just enough for him to see the shadow of a guard enter the hallway. The alien walked past him without noticing. Its heavy, metal-clad boots clanged against the floor, and its slow, confident movements were almost mechanical. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't dare make a sound. He had to wait, to be patient. He was so close. The alien continued down the hallway, its back turned, but it paused when it reached a control panel embedded in the wall. Ethan's mind raced. This was his chance. With the alien distracted, he could slip into the control room and make his move. As the guard began fiddling with the panel, Ethan moved. He moved fast, and he moved silently, his body pressed against the walls as he crept toward the door. His hand reached out to the handle again, and this time he was ready. The door clicked open quietly, and he slipped inside, holding his breath. Inside the control room, everything was sleek and intimidating. Monitors lit up the room with alien symbols and holographic displays, their screens showing images of distant stars, maps, and coordinates. Ethan's eyes darted over everything, trying to make sense of the strange technology. It wasn't human. Nothing here was familiar. But there was something he recognized. The power systems, the defense mechanisms. It was all there, just waiting for someone to take control. Ethan knew he didn't have much time. He couldn't rely on brute force. He needed strategy. His fingers flew over the console, tapping in the sequence he remembered from his training. He'd studied alien technology in case of situations like this, but he'd never imagined actually using it. The console beeped in response, and a holographic map of the ship popped up in front of him. The security systems were online. The defense shields were active. But he could see that the ship's communication systems were vulnerable. He could send a message, make contact with Earth. But he could also cripple the ship from the inside, destroy their navigation systems, and send them off course. Ethan's hand hovered over the keys. There were too many options, too many ways to make his move. He needed to think quickly. If the guard noticed he was missing, if they realized what he was doing, everything would be over. He'd be dead before he could even finish his mission. His finger pressed the button to disable the shields. The first step was done. Now, to turn their own weapons against them. Suddenly, a loud alarm sounded. The ship trembled, as if protesting the change in its systems. Ethan's pulse shot through the roof. He had made the right choice, but now the clock was ticking. They knew he was here. The door to the control room slammed open. Ethan spun around, eyes wide, but there was no time to react. The alien guard had returned, and he wasn't alone. "We have a human in the control room," one of them shouted, their voice sharp and angry. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the doorway as more figures appeared, flooding into the room. Ethan's heart raced. There was no escape now, but at least he had caused chaos. At least they knew he was coming for them, and that, for the first time in a long while, gave him hope. He raised his fists, ready for the fight of his life. The galaxy would soon learn the cost of crossing humanity. The control room was a whirlwind of chaos. Alarms blared loudly, their shrill sounds echoing through the metal walls. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but his focus was unshaken. The aliens flooded into the room, their glowing eyes sharp with anger. They were fast, too fast. But Ethan was quicker. He had no choice but to act now, or everything he had worked for would be destroyed in an instant. "Get him." One of the aliens screamed, its voice harsh and commanding. The others rushed forward, their heavy boots pounding against the floor, their weapons raised. Ethan's mind worked in overdrive as he assessed his options. There were too many of them, too many armed aliens closing in. But he wasn't about to give up now. He couldn't, not when he was so close. His fingers flew over the control console, desperately searching for a way to defend himself. His eyes darted from screen to screen. The ship's systems were in disarray, and he knew he had only a few seconds before the aliens completely took control. If he could cause more damage, disrupt their systems further, it would buy him time to escape. One of the aliens lunged forward, a sharp weapon in hand. Ethan dodged to the side, his body moving on pure instinct. The alien's weapon missed by mere inches, striking the control panel instead. Sparks flew, and the screen flickered violently, casting shadows on the walls. It was a small victory, but it gave Ethan the opening he needed. With a burst of strength, he grabbed a nearby metal pipe that had fallen from the damaged console. He swung it toward the nearest alien, knocking the weapon from its grasp. The alien stumbled back in shock, its comrades hesitating for a moment as they realized he wasn't as helpless as they had assumed. But that brief moment of hesitation was enough. Ethan was relentless. He spun around, swinging the pipe again, this time connecting with another alien's shoulder. It howled in pain, clutching its arm. But Ethan didn't stop. He kept moving, staying ahead of their strikes, using the alien's confusion to his advantage. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a warrior. And the galaxy had just learned that humanity would not be easily subdued. As one of the aliens made a move to circle around him, Ethan's eyes caught a flashing red button on the console, an emergency override switch. It was risky, but it was his only chance. If he could activate it, he might be able to lock the aliens out of their systems completely. He darted toward the console, pushing the pipe into the face of one alien who tried to grab him. The blow sent it stumbling backward, giving him just enough time to slam his hand down on the button. The ship trembled as the systems went offline. Lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, everything was still. The aliens stopped in their tracks, disoriented, unable to comprehend what had happened. They had lost control. Ethan didn't waste a second. The moment the lights came back on, he was moving. He grabbed a discarded weapon from the floor, a strange-looking blaster that hummed with energy, and aimed it at the alien closest to him. The beam shot out with a crackling sound, hitting the alien square in the chest. It staggered back, smoke rising from the wound, before it crumpled to the floor. The others hesitated, panic starting to seep into their movements. They hadn't anticipated this. A human soldier, alone, fighting back with everything he had. Their arrogance had clouded their judgment. They thought they had won. They thought they had conquered Earth. But now they realized the truth. Humanity was not so easily broken. Ethan didn't let up. He fired again, the blaster crackling with energy as he took down another alien. The room seemed to shrink around him as the remaining attackers regrouped, their fear giving way to rage. They weren't going to let him go that easily. But Ethan knew what he had to do. He couldn't keep fighting them forever. He had to get to the ship's core and disable it, or the chaos would never stop. But before he could make another move, one of the aliens lunged at him from behind. Its claws reached out, grabbing his shoulder and spinning him around. For a moment, Ethan thought he was done. Its grip was like iron, and its teeth were bared in a snarl. But the soldier inside him never wavered. He brought his knee up into the alien's chest with all his strength. The creature gasped, its grip loosening for a split second. That was all the time Ethan needed. He kicked the alien away, sending it stumbling backward. With one final, desperate move, Ethan aimed the blaster at its head and fired. The alien crumpled, dead before it hit the ground. Ethan didn't pause to savor his victory. He turned toward the hallway and started running. His legs burned with exhaustion, but he pushed through it. The blaster was still in his hand, and he kept it raised as he moved through the ship, every step bringing him closer to the heart of the alien vessel. There was no turning back now. His enemies had made a grave mistake, and Ethan Carter was determined to make them pay for it. He had only one goal: revenge. The galaxy would soon learn that humanity was not a species to be taken lightly, and Ethan was going to show them exactly what happened when you dared to take a human prisoner. The corridors of the alien ship stretched ahead, dark and twisted, as if mocking Ethan's resolve. He had fought his way through the control room, but that was just the beginning. The aliens weren't going to let him get away easily. They were relentless, and their ship was vast, far more vast than anything he had encountered before. Yet the fire inside him burned brighter than ever. His footsteps echoed off the cold, metallic walls. His muscles screamed in protest, but he ignored the pain. He couldn't afford to slow down now. The message he had sent out, the chaos he had caused, would soon reach other human colonies. They would know what had happened to him, and they would come. They had to. He couldn't do this alone. The ship seemed alive, its humming engines vibrating through the very walls, its sensors tracking every movement. Ethan knew that at any moment, the aliens would try to capture him again, or worse, kill him. He couldn't afford to let that happen. Not when he was this close. He stopped briefly at a junction, his mind working quickly. To reach the heart of the ship, he needed to find a way into the central core, where the energy systems were located. That was where he could cause the most damage. If he could overload the reactors, he could disable their power, send the entire ship into chaos. It would buy the time needed for reinforcements to arrive, if they were coming. The problem was, he had no idea how to get there. This ship wasn't human. The layout was completely alien. Ethan had no maps, no guides, only the instinct and training that had kept him alive this long. A sharp sound came from behind him, breaking his thoughts. Footsteps, many of them. His breath caught in his throat. The aliens had found him. His eyes darted around, seeking a way out. The hallway in front of him seemed to go on forever. There was no turning back now. He could hear the sound of alien voices, speaking in rapid, guttural tones. They were close. In an instant, Ethan made his decision. He couldn't outrun them, but he could fight. He turned and ran toward a door to his left, a large, steel door that looked like it led to some kind of storage room. It was his only option. He barely made it inside before the aliens rounded the corner, their eyes glowing in the dim light. They saw him, and their growls echoed through the narrow hallway. Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't hesitate. He slammed the door shut behind him and locked it with the control panel. The storage room was small, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. It was filled with strange containers, tubes, and equipment he didn't recognize. His mind raced as he scanned the room for something, anything that could help him. He had to think fast. He spotted a heavy metal crate near the back of the room. The top was slightly ajar, revealing what looked like weapons, alien rifles, strange energy shields. He didn't know how to use them, but he had no choice. He rushed to the crate, grabbed one of the rifles, and checked the power cell. It hummed to life in his hands. He knew how to use it. The instincts of a soldier kicked in, and he felt a brief surge of confidence. With this, he could hold off the aliens long enough to escape. But as he turned to face the door, ready to fight, he heard something even more chilling than the sound of the aliens outside. A low hum, a deep vibration beneath his feet. The ship was shifting, changing. Something was happening. The aliens outside began to scream in alarm, their voices laced with panic. Ethan's eyes widened as the walls trembled once more, and the entire room seemed to shake. The power was failing. Suddenly, the door began to shudder. The aliens outside were trying to break it down. There was no time. Ethan aimed the rifle at the door, bracing himself for the impact. The door splintered as the aliens hit it with their weapons, their screeches filling the air. He couldn't hold them off for long. He needed to act fast. Ethan raised the rifle and fired. The energy blast tore through the door, striking the first alien to come through. It collapsed, twitching, to the ground. But more poured in. Their eyes were filled with rage, their bodies larger, stronger than any human could hope to be. Ethan fired again and again, each blast striking its mark. But for every alien he took down, 2 more replaced it. His body was running on adrenaline now. His muscles were sore, his hands shaky, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop, not when he had come this far. Then, just as the door was about to collapse completely, a loud crack echoed through the room. The ship shook again, harder this time. The power flickered. The control systems were failing. Ethan smiled grimly. It was working. The ship was coming apart. The aliens were still charging forward, but their movements were disjointed now. Their technology was malfunctioning, their weapons sparking and fizzling. Ethan wasn't sure how much longer he could keep fighting, but he didn't care. He had done what he came here to do. Suddenly, the lights went out. Complete darkness surrounded him. The low hum of the ship's engines stopped. The tremors beneath his feet grew stronger. And then, silence. The aliens stopped moving. Ethan held his breath. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. A faint, distant rumble echoed in the darkness. A booming sound like thunder. The ship was falling apart. The power had gone completely, and the systems were shutting down one by one. Ethan stood in the darkness, the weapon still in his hand. The aliens were gone, at least for now. He had done it. He had crippled their ship, bought humanity the time they needed. Now, it was up to them to finish what he had started. Ethan crouched low in the shadows, his breath shallow, trying to steady his racing heart. The ship was alive with noise now, but it wasn't the usual sounds of alien voices or machinery. It was the chaos of a dying vessel. Sparks crackled in the walls, and the sound of metal groaning under strain filled the air. The emergency lights flickered on and off, casting eerie glows across the darkened halls. He could hear them, alien soldiers, moving swiftly in every direction. The failed systems had thrown their communications into disarray, but their instincts remained razor-sharp. They were hunting for him. They would stop at nothing to capture or eliminate him. Ethan could feel the weight of the mission pressing on him. He had done what no human soldier had ever done before, crippled their ship, disrupted their power systems, but that had only made them more dangerous. They were on high alert now, and they were closing in. Every move he made had to be calculated. The blaster was still in his hand, the weapon humming with energy. He'd taken down a few of them, but the fight was far from over. The aliens knew the layout of their ship, knew how to navigate its dark, twisting corridors. He didn't. The advantage was slipping away. But that was when he remembered something. Something that could tip the balance in his favor. The ship wasn't just about the aliens. It was a colossal piece of advanced technology. And somewhere within it, there had to be a weak point. Ethan wasn't a technical genius, but he knew enough about alien vessels to understand that every ship had a core, something that powered everything. It was his only chance now. If he could get to that core, he could finish what he'd started and shut the ship down for good. A plan started to form in his mind. He had to make it to the reactor. But it wouldn't be easy. The aliens would expect him to try. They'd set traps, guarded the most important areas. It was a risk, but it was the only one left. Taking a deep breath, he moved cautiously, his footsteps light against the cold metal floor. He passed through the darkened hallways, using every bit of cover he could find. Every sound made him freeze. Every shadow felt like an enemy. He had no illusions now. He was alone. Even if his people were coming, it would be hours, maybe days, before they could find him. The way forward was difficult. He had to slip past alien patrols, avoid triggering alarms, and stay off their radar. At one point, he was forced to hide behind a stack of alien crates as two soldiers passed by. His heart was in his throat as they stopped just a few feet away. He could feel their presence, their eyes searching the darkness. The silence felt endless, as if time itself had stopped. Finally, the patrol moved on, and Ethan let out a slow breath of relief. His pulse was still racing, but he knew he couldn't afford to linger. He had to keep moving. The path ahead seemed to open up, and Ethan found himself entering a massive chamber, the core of the ship. It was filled with rows upon rows of alien machinery, glowing with strange, pulsating lights. At the far end of the room stood the reactor. It hummed with unnatural power, its energy fields glowing bright blue, almost too much to look at directly. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. But getting close wasn't going to be easy. The room was heavily guarded. Alien sentries paced the perimeter, and their movements were synchronized. Too precise, too coordinated. They had set up a full security detail. There was no way he could sneak past them. Ethan pressed himself against the wall, his mind racing for a solution. He could try to fight them, but there were too many. Even if he took a few down, they would alert the rest of the ship. He needed a distraction. He needed something to draw their attention away, something that would give him the window he needed. His eyes flicked to the control panels scattered across the room. They looked similar to the ones in the control room he had disabled earlier, only these were more advanced, more connected to the ship's systems. If he could get to one of them and overload it, it might cause a temporary blackout, long enough to slip past the guards. With a sense of determination, he crept toward the closest panel, his movements slow and deliberate. As he reached the panel, he felt a cold sweat on the back of his neck. He quickly knelt down and began working on the console, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. The aliens had made sure their systems were locked down tight, but they hadn't accounted for him. Human ingenuity and persistence. It took only a moment for him to hack into the system, his fingers flying over the touchpad. Sparks shot from the panel as it powered down, and then everything went dark. The entire room plunged into darkness, and for one breathless moment, the world stopped. The hum of the reactor ceased. The guards froze. Ethan didn't wait. He sprinted forward, his eyes trained on the glowing blue core. The alien shouts filled the air as they scrambled to figure out what had happened. But it was too late. Ethan had already reached the reactor. With a single thought, He activated the override on the reactor, sending a surge of energy into the core. The ship shook violently as the reactor overloaded, a massive explosion of light and power erupting from the core. Ethan threw himself to the ground as the shockwave hit, the blast nearly knocking him off his feet. The alien soldiers screamed, but their cries were drowned out by the deafening roar of the explosion. The ship was coming apart. He had done it. The reactor was destroyed. The core was gone. Now, the ship was no more than a wreck, hurtling toward its own destruction. Ethan knew this wasn't over yet. The aliens would be out for revenge, and reinforcements were still on their way. But for now, he had won. For now, he had ensured humanity's survival. The galaxy would never forget the day one human soldier took on the might of an alien empire and brought their ship to its knees. And the revenge, that was just beginning. Ethan's body trembled with the aftershocks of the explosion. He barely registered the ringing in his ears or the acrid smoke filling the air. His vision blurred, the stench of burning metal and the faint, desperate cries of the aliens mingling in the chaos around him. The ship was breaking apart, and he had caused it. It wasn't just the reactor that was failing now. The entire vessel seemed to be tearing itself apart, pieces of the ship crumbling, falling away into the vacuum of space. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline keeping him moving even though his body screamed for rest. He had no choice but to keep moving, or he'd be caught in the collapse. The corridors were a maze of shattered walls, sparking wires, and flickering lights. The alien soldiers were panicking, but their movements were frantic, desperate. They no longer operated as a coordinated force. Their command structure was in disarray. Ethan knew that he had crippled them, but the damage wasn't enough. If he didn't escape soon, the destruction would catch up to him, and it wouldn't matter what he'd accomplished. He pushed forward, slipping through the wreckage, his pulse racing. His fingers were stiff from the fight, but his mind was sharp. He couldn't afford to let the thrill of victory cloud his judgment. The ship was collapsing in on itself, and his only chance of survival lay in reaching the escape pods. He rounded a corner, and there it was, a narrow hallway leading to an emergency exit. The sign above the door flickered in and out of existence, but Ethan knew it was the right place. Escape pods. It was his last hope. But just as he took his first step toward the door, a low growl echoed from behind him. He turned, instinctively raising his weapon, only to find himself face to face with a towering alien soldier. Its skin was a sickly, mottled gray, its black eyes gleaming with hatred as it raised its weapon toward him. Ethan's hand tightened around his blaster, but the alien was fast, too fast. It fired first, a bolt of blue energy streaking toward him. He ducked instinctively, feeling the heat of the blast pass inches from his face. He didn't hesitate. In one smooth motion, he aimed and fired back. The shot hit the alien square in the chest, and it fell backward with a grotesque screech. But Ethan didn't stop. He couldn't. He turned on his heel and sprinted down the hallway, pushing himself harder, faster. His every step was fueled by pure survival instinct. The escape pods were just ahead, but the entire ship was shaking now. The walls groaned as if they were alive, bending and cracking under the strain. He could feel the floor beneath him shifting, and he gritted his teeth. It was too close. He needed to make it. He had to make it. Finally, he reached the door to the escape pod chamber. The terminal was flickering, a few sparks arcing across it as he approached. He didn't waste time. His fingers flew over the control panel, overriding the lock codes, and within seconds, the door slid open. Ethan rushed inside and scrambled toward the nearest pod. It was small, cramped, but it was his only way out. He barely registered the sound of footsteps behind him, but he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The air around him felt thick with tension. His heart raced as he climbed into the pod and slammed the hatch shut. The pod's emergency systems kicked in, and with a violent jolt, it detached from the dying ship. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the ship began to disintegrate behind him, a massive explosion sending a shockwave through space. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The ship, once so massive and imposing, was now reduced to nothing more than burning debris. He had done it. He had escaped. But as Ethan floated in the cold vacuum of space, drifting away from the wreckage of the alien vessel, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. His hands tightened around the controls as he set a course for the nearest human colony. The mission was far from over. The aliens would retaliate. They would come after him, and after humanity, with everything they had. Ethan knew that what he had done would be remembered by the galaxy. He had struck a blow that would echo through the stars. But the war was far from finished. The battle for humanity's survival had only just begun. And Ethan, he was ready. The galaxy had no idea what it was about to face. As the stars stretched out before him, he whispered to himself, "Let them come."